Hi, everyone. A very, very good evening to all those who have joined in. My name is Pranati, and I work as an associate of Belong Research Collective. And I welcome you all to the seventh day of the inaugural edition of the xSDG UnConference, which is an initiative of Belong. A bit about Belong. Belong is a social innovation platform that seeks to offer discrimination-free services to people who are otherwise marginalized on the basis of their identities, such as caste, gender, ethnicity, disability, etc. And we run programs for three major verticals: the Research Collective, of which this UnConference is a part of, the Mental Health Collective, and the Literature Collective. You can learn more about all of these different platforms at www.belong.net. I will be putting the link to that in the chat box as well. The xSDG UnConference is extremely delighted to have you all with us. It is a part of one of our most major initiatives at Belong, which is called xSDG, in which X stands for Intersectionality, which is a global platform to promote truly intersectional and inclusive development. At xSDG, we've been curating resources in terms of research papers, reports, data sets that are focused on development through the lens of these intersectional identities that I earlier mentioned. And we have plans to host some podcasts around the wonderful themes that emerge from conversations like this panel right here. We also aim to create a space where such collaborations can also take off in the future. The UnConference is being held in collaboration with organizations such as Dalberg, Breakthrough India, and our lovely partners, JPAL South Asia, who are also co-hosting this panel with us. The UnConference started on the 18th of August and will go up all the way to the 31st of August. And we'd be really, really happy to have you for the future sessions as well. We have about 15 plus panels around understanding how SDG programming and funding can better address the needs of people who face prejudice due to their identity. Which again includes gender, sexual orientation, race, caste, disability, age, etc. And if you if you wish to learn more about these topics and these different sessions that are there, I'll put the link in the chat box below. And should you have any questions, please feel free to use our email ID, which is xsdg@belong.net. Once again, a huge thank you to all our panelists for joining in and to our lovely team at JPAL South Asia for co-hosting it with us. I now hand it over to Sharanya, who will be moderating the session and will walk us through the details for it as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pranati. Very excited to collaborate with you on this conference. Hello, everyone. I'm Sharanya Chandran, Associate Director of Policy at JPAL South Asia. And as part of this role, I work with a range of stakeholders in India and across the South Asian region, government, civil society, private partners, as well as donors, to further JPAL's goal, which is essentially of initiating high quality research and translating this evidence into policy action. So thank you for joining today's panel discussion, From Research to Action, Designing Inclusive Policies. Today's panel is one of the many sessions being hosted by xSDG UnConference, as Pranati mentioned, and JPAL is sort of hosting 5 of these. This is the 4th of the series, and the last one is tomorrow on designing inclusive MEL, monitoring, evaluation, and learning systems for SDGs. So a quick introduction to our esteemed group of panelists today. We have Dr. Ashwini Deshpande, who is Professor of Economics and the founding director of Center for Economics, Data and Analysis at Ashoka University. Welcome, Professor Deshpande. She's been working, on economics of discrimination and affirmative action with a focus on caste and gender, especially in India. She's authored multiple books, including The Grammar of Caste, Economic Discrimination in Contemporary India, also Boundaries of Clan and Color, and Transnational Comparisons of Intergroup Disparity, among others. She's received multiple honors and awards, including the Exim Bank Award for Outstanding Dissertation and the VKR Rao Award for Indian economists under 45. We have Ms. Meera Shenoy, who's really a system changer in the space of disability rights. She is a pioneer in job-linked skilling for rural, tribal, and now youth with disabilities. She really was the executive director of EGMM, the first state government skilling mission, which she, set up from scratch and then took it to scale. And it also influenced Government of India's skilling policy, the national skilling policy. And subsequently, she set up Youth for Jobs, which is sort of India's largest organization, skilling youth with disabilities and linking them to jobs. Welcome, Ms. Shenoy. We have Mr. Wilson, who will be joining us shortly, Mr. Bezwada Wilson, who is an Indian activist and one of the founders and national conveners of Safai Karamchari Andolan, SKA, an Indian human rights organization that has been campaigning for the eradication of manual scavenging. His work at SKA, a community-driven movement, has been really instrumental in furthering a lot of policies around this issue. He's been recognized by Ashoka Foundation and has received the prestigious Ramon Magsaysay Award. So we'll be welcoming Mr. Wilson soon. And we have Noreen Giga from our JPAL North America office. She's a research manager, and the North America office has really been striving to catalyze research to advance racial equity, promote inclusion in economics, and center community voices in research practices. Prior to joining JPAL, Noreen supported research to document experiences of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer youths in K-12 education. So before calling upon the panelists, I thought I'll quickly share a bit about our motivation for convening this panel today so that it can just set the context. So we all know about UN's 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which includes sort of a pledge of leaving no one behind, in recognition of the fact that dignity of humans is fundamental. And in this journey of ensuring no one behind, the pathway is to reach the furthest behind first. But how do you really achieve this? So the fundamental starting point is that individuals have different identity markers. Praniti mentioned there's gender, sexual orientation, race, caste, ability, faith, age, which mediate their access to SDG programs and services. And this gets even more challenging when there are multiple intersections of these identity markers, which overlap and interact with each other. So for instance, gender inequality intersects with other systems of oppression like caste or ability, and these intersections in turn contribute to unique experiences of oppression and privilege. So such an intersectional lens will help us both understand and respond to these complex and multifaceted identities, describing the way that inequalities and oppression manifest themselves, but also proposing ways in which development programs can then be tweaked and interventions be shaped. So in yesterday's xSDG Research Showcase, which was a joint session by JPAL and Ideas for India, we saw multiple examples of emerging intersectional research, which looks at various identities within a single target group and sees how best to, one, identify the biases, and two, mitigate the prejudices. So for instance, how do we uncover exclusionary attitudes? So an innovative study randomly sort of assigned caste markers to student tests and found that teachers systematically gave lower scores to students that they thought belonged to lower castes. Similarly, understanding, if there's discrimination in the job market in the way firms view the CVs of immigrants and so on and so forth. There were multiple interesting studies. So that's on the identification of the biases. The second is the solutioning part, right? So we have solutions that have been tested through rigorous research on strategies to mitigate these biases or even change social norms. For instance, a school-based program designed by NGO Breakthrough in India and evaluated by JPAL researchers, targeting adolescent boys and girls, through an innovative pedagogy, school-based pedagogy of discussions, persuasion to reduce people's support for restrictive gender norms, was found to be really effective in changing gender attitudes among adolescent children in Haryana. And now subsequently, it's being scaled up in other states like Punjab. But once that's the whole challenge, right? Once all of this research is done, how do we translate this into action? And how can policy decisions be aligned with preferences and experiences of individuals belonging to different identities? So for starters, there is the question of diversity and representation, to start with in economics itself, which is an important issue. But equally, while designing development programs, and we have research to back this up, for instance, multiple randomized evaluations of reservations for women, women leaders in politics have found that, these quotas, reservation quotas, influence women's political participation and policy outcomes and increased the provision of public goods aligned with women's voter preferences, female voters' preferences. And so I think this is the issue that this panel would hope to discuss. So while evaluating social programs, designing and evaluating them, how can we ensure that inclusion is at the forefront as opposed to as an afterthought? So for instance, do remedial education programs address constraints faced by children with special needs? Do sanitation programs take into consideration caste dynamics? And so on and so forth. And so I think we have a diverse panel. So how can all of us come together as researchers, advocacy groups, NGOs, governments, and donors to constantly work on how to smooth the research to action funnel for better and more inclusive policies? Because this funnel is not so, this process is not so linear. And so I think that is the whole goal. So we will start with 5 to 6 minutes of opening remarks from each of the panelists, post which we will have a moderated Q&A, and finally we'll have an audience Q&A. So quick note to the audience, please type your questions with whoever you want to pose it to in the Q&A box or the chat box, and please actively participate in this discussion. So we'd like to start by inviting Professor Deshpande to share her remarks on her work in this area, and what are some of these challenges on the research to action funnel that she has faced and encountered.
Mute. Thank you so much, Sharanya. Thank you, JPAL and Belong for inviting me to this event. Congratulations on organizing a really interesting week of talks and discussions. I have a set of slides only to keep myself on track. Otherwise, teachers, they keep on talking. So it's just helpful to have a set of slides. So, the agenda for this session is actually really vast, and it's very hard to sort of cull these sense down into a few minutes. But here are my few thoughts, and more questions can come up in the Q&A. So the question is, how much of academic research directly percolates into policy? Actually, if you look at the direct connection, it's not a whole lot. JPAL, of course, collaborates with governments in India and elsewhere, and conducts randomized control trials to evaluate the effectiveness of a particular policy. Now, the thing is that think about RCTs is that they're expensive, they are time consuming, and they're very difficult to run correctly and rigorously. And most researchers don't have the kinds of deep pockets that are needed, or access to deep pockets that are needed, and the massive organizational structure that is needed, essential to run a good RCT. So while it's important, JPAL's work is, of course, obviously very important, very pathbreaking, and highly influential. There is a whole body of other work that I think can also play a role in informing policy. Particularly what I want to say is that in terms of, the word that we now learn to use repeatedly, which is low-hanging fruit, thanks to Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo's book. And it's really important to understand what works in terms of low-hanging fruit. And these experiments contribute to that. But we also need foundational research to understand the broader structures of advantage and disadvantage. And as Sharanya said, the role of social identity in mediating these patterns. So of course you can run, if you already are aware of a particular axis of advantage or disadvantage, you could run an RCT and confirm that indeed people do behave that way. But at the same time, we need foundational research to understand the nuances of how social identity shapes the multiplicity of advantages and disadvantages. And there is excellent research outside of the RCT framework that should also inform policy design, even though that research may not directly collaborate with government. So that's a sort of a broader point I want to make. Why should we do that? Is first of all, when we talk about inclusive policies, we need to know who to include. Inclusive policies towards which individuals or which group, which then we'll have to start by answering the question, if we want to include some groups, that means they must already be excluded to a large extent. So who's excluded from a particular set of, programs or policies, or, just even development patterns? It may not be government per se, it could be the private sector as well. So which are the groups that are excluded and why are they excluded? What are the particular sources of disadvantage? Is it stigma? Is it just historical disadvantage? Is it current discrimination? What are the exact reasons why particular groups and individuals might be excluded? And then how should this imbalance be remedied? What policies will work best to remedy these exclusions? And how will these policies be implemented? So there is this whole matrix, there's this whole set of factors that on which in countries across the world, including in India, there is excellent research, but all that should be considered by policy makers. I mean, that can only be one's hope that it will be considered. But that's the plea that I want to make in today's in my comments today. What this would mean is, now stepping back, is an openness to examining evidence and willingness to engage with it. Which means that if there are groups, if there is research which is rigorous and thorough, and it finds evidence of gaps, systematic gaps between groups, and if it calls for policies to compensate for the disadvantage, it cannot be just dismissed as appeasement or vote bank politics or something else, right? Because if we examine the evidence and find evidence of disadvantage, that will call for policies to remedy that disadvantage, which will mean that it will invite compensatory discrimination in favor of those groups who are excluded. And there must be a willingness in the policy space to examine the evidence dispassionately and to be willing to engage with sources of disadvantage, and to be willing to formulate a set of policies that will engage with of these sources and remedy those. And then we amongst these panelists, I think this is an open and shut question. We are not even debating it, but the recognition that social identity matters in terms of producing a structure of disadvantage is not so obvious to many people, including in the policy world. All of us who are speaking as panelists here, we are convinced about it, but I have now realized through generations of students and talking to stakeholders that it's not always accepted. For example, I have a recent paper with my co-author Rajesh Ramachandran, where we look at stunting, which is a low height, which is height for age, which is below a certain a marker. And we find that there are in fact caste differences in stunting. And one of the things that we are finding is that where the self-reported practice of untouchability is higher, it results in greater stunting for Dalit children, but not for upper caste children. So there is a stigma of untouchability that operates in society, that produces higher rates of stunting for Dalit children. Now, this is an uncomfortable truth, but if our research is correct, and if it is valid, it's an uncomfortable truth that we have to face, and we have to remedy that, right? So that's the kind of openness to research that I think we need to inculcate within the policy space. Now, intersectionality, of course, goes at the heart of it, which is, it's not just caste, or it's not just gender, it's not just sexual orientation or any other axis of disadvantage. Within that, men and women have different patterns. Even within gender, if you look at women, then upper caste women and Dalit women's experiences are vastly different. So I can talk about this in greater detail later on, but at the moment I'm just placing it out there. So again, for intersectionality as well, we have to, the point about willingness to examine evidence and the willingness to engage with it matters a great deal. How can that be done? We have to be able to make data available in real time. in not after a lag of several years, when a particular phenomenon that data might capture is already old or has already modified or changed its form and its shape. So we need data in real time, and the scientific community in India is huge, and there are Indians in the scientific community abroad who are very concerned and are deeply committed to suggesting solutions. So a trust in the scientific community, making data available in real time, and utilizing India's massive knowledge expertise, the scientific manpower, to its advantage. So trust all of us who are working with data and analyzing patterns, and are willing to work with whoever wants to work with us to develop solutions. And so I think that's the need of the hour. However, my last point here is that the sort of mistrust of the scientific community or the challenges to scientific thought are not just restricted to India. All over the world, we are seeing that, particularly in the time of COVID. When you see the vaccination and masking debates in the United States, here in India, we would die to, we would really die. Sorry, excuse me, not the wrong word, is the wrong word to use in that context. But there are millions of Indians who are really willing to get vaccines as quickly as possible. But the problem is there's a shortage of vaccines. And when we see debates in the United States where people are refusing to get vaccinated, even despite the abundance of vaccines available, it seems a bit unfair to us sitting in India. So the challenges to scientific inputs, the resistance to scientific advice, the resistance to not looking at evidence, the resistance to evidence, tendency to not look at evidence, unfortunately is global. It's not a phenomenon that we see only in India. And I think that's a real challenge when we think of how to design inclusive policies, how to translate research into action. Let me stop here and take more questions in the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Professor Deshpande, for highlighting this very useful way of thinking through this entire issue, which is go to the root of the problem of exclusion, think of the remedies, and then see how implementation of those remedies can be actioned. And it's not only an India issue, it's a global issue. I think that's a really good thought that you've left us with, because this is a good segue for me to invite Noreen, who is at JPAL North America, to give us some of the perspectives of the office's work on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and sort of what are some of the challenges faced in the US, because I think some of these also resonate across contexts. So I think it would be really nice to hear from you on this theme now.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Yes, I'm happy to share some thoughts about the work that we've been doing at the JPAL North America Regional Office in terms of embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion in our work, because we really do see this as an essential part of being able to address the root causes of poverty. And at JPAL North America, we've been working as staff. We've also been working with our network of researchers to bring a DEI lens to our work. And what I wanted to start off with was just highlighting three main ways that we've been doing that. So one is looking at the screening criteria that we use when looking at requests for proposals to review and ensure that we're prioritizing and funding studies that focus on the intersection of poverty, race, and racism. We've also been working to spearhead research that focuses specifically on issues of race and racism in the United States. And then third, developing a pipeline to increase representation of students from historically excluded groups in the field of economics. So again, I think a lot of these things that have already been touched on here in this panel. And when we look at our RFP cycle, our alignment has always been to ensure that projects align with goals at of the organization. But over the years, we've really refined this guidance in order to explicitly include racism as a consideration for mission alignment. And this is guidance that is not just shared with reviewers, but also shared with applicants at the outset to be very transparent about what it is that we are looking for and what we're hoping to receive in terms of projects. And so the hope is that this is going to not just help in terms of how we're reviewing projects internally, but really help at the outset in terms of sparking more discussions and influencing what types of projects that we receive and who chooses to apply, especially as this intersects with race and racism in the projects. And in terms of contributions that we've seen, I just wanted to highlight that we've really seen this be influenced by the staff at our organization who have really seen this and kind of pushed for internal conversations to make this more a part of the criteria, and also seeing some of these just kind of events that happen around the world and in the US in terms of the American Economics Association Climate Survey, the Black Lives Matters protests, and seeing how that has really accelerated the changes that we have been making as an organization. The second area that I wanted to touch on is focus on spearheading research that focuses specifically on issues of race and racism in the US. So JPAL North America, as has been happening also globally, has spearheaded a number of research projects that look at race and racism. And these studies span issues from structural racism, labor market discrimination, to the importance of doctor-patient racial concordance for health outcomes. And I wanted to highlight just one example of recent research on labor market discrimination that comes from a working paper from JPAL affiliates, where the researchers used a massive resume audit study to document systemic patterns of employment discrimination at large companies across the United States. And they did this by randomly assigning racially distinctive names to resumes, and then they measured discrimination based on differences in callback rates. And they detected 23 employers that are clearly engaged in discrimination with Black applicants. And so this is really actionable evidence. And JPAL has worked with researchers to place information about this in the New York Times to ensure that this study is highlighted. But beyond that, JPAL is really working with researchers to figure out how to further catalyze this research into action in a way that could really lead to meaningful policy change. This is from a recent working paper, so I think we have so much more to see in terms of the impact that this could have. And the third area that I wanted to touch on is developing a pipeline to increase representation of students from historically excluded groups in the field of economics. I think as we've touched on, I think as we'll hear throughout this panel, it really does matter who's in the room and who's in these spaces that are having conversations around policies and that are also setting the research agenda. And in economics, students and professionals who are women, Black, Latinx, Indigenous, or from other historical excluded groups are underrepresented at every stage in the pipeline in the economics profession. And there are many different reasons for this exclusion. Could include less formal preparation, as well as just the implicit bias that occurs during different stages of the evaluation process. And there's also a hidden curriculum that disadvantages individuals from groups that aren't already well represented in the economics profession. And so where we saw the RFP changes coming more at the staff level, this focus on the pipeline in economics has really been driven by the researchers in the JPAL network, led by our co-founder, Esther Duflo, as well as the co-scientific director, Amy Finkelstein at JPAL North America. And their work is launching new programs through what they're calling the Economics Transformation Project to run introductory and advanced workshops, mentorship pairing, and networking opportunities to broaden participation and support and include historically excluded voices at every stage of the pipeline. And so ultimately, the goal of this project is to initiate long-term structural change, to transform the field of economics by increasing representation of historically excluded groups and increasing their influence on policies that affect every aspect of public life. And so those are just a few of the areas that I wanted to highlight that we're focusing on at JPAL North America. I'm really excited to continue the conversation with the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Noreen. That was very insightful, especially the way you touched upon the points wearing a donor hat, because sometimes you have to shape RFP criteria to be able to shape what gets researched and who by whom. And then you spoke about the research to action funnel through an example of labor market discrimination and how the office is making efforts to funnel this, to strengthen this research to action funnel so that, whatever we learn is meaningfully fed into policy decisions. And finally, on the ecosystem level, how do you broaden participation of historically excluded voices at each stage of the funnel? I'm now going to turn it over to Meera to really give us an insight. Now, I think we are also moving from the research to action funnel as we go on to the different panelists, because Meera's work has been really embedded with action, much closer to action and for inclusive development programming, but also working closely with policy stakeholders. So what has that process been, Meera? Can you take us through some of the journeys that you've had with your work, on the skilling side, but also on, youth for jobs, of targeting those who are, disabled. So can you take us through this journey and, shed light on this?
Thanks, JPAL and Belong. I think it's wonderful to be once in a way among economists and give, it's not something I always do, because I'm always on panels of either livelihood or poverty alleviation. So this is interesting, and loved to listen to the two speakers before me. So good panel. I started Youth for Jobs 9 years back. What actually excited me and helped me to make a choice of what I should do was statistics and data. 80% of the world's disabled population is supposed to be in developing countries like India. Their education levels are low, their employment levels are low. So I asked myself this question: is it possible for me to pull them out of the vicious cycle of poverty and put them into the virtuous cycle of opportunity, using skilling and jobs as the medium? Because my previous work in senior positions in the government, in the multilateral funders, had all shown me very clearly that if you give a job to one member of the family, it takes the entire family out of poverty in a very sustained manner. And I knew this would be far, far more transformational for the vulnerable like the disabled. Today, I'm happy to say that despite the various challenges, we've become the largest in South Asia in this space. And the big difference is that when you work in the field of inclusion, it's not enough to be a skilling organization alone. You just have to be a system changer. You just have to work on the ecosphere. Otherwise, you do not create the kind of impact which you want to do. So one big chunk of our work is actually changing mindsets of what I call the 3 C's. One is the rural community, because India has 69% villages. The second C is colleges, because youth don't enroll there and the educators don't understand. So they have a degree in hand, but they're completely unemployable. And the third is companies, because companies, while they don't have the myths which the villagers have, what they have is a lot of unconscious biases like disabled, and quite often they don't understand disabilities because you don't see people with disabilities on the road like the West. None of our public facilities are accessible. So the second part of our work is our skilling programs, which are really large. The largest program we have is a pan-India one, which skills less educated youth with disabilities from villages and tier 2 towns and puts them into jobs. Just to give you an example, we are a knowledge partner of Amazon. And in the last 1.5 years, we've put 1,400 at least speech and hearing impaired youth in Amazon pan-India. And today we are the sole supplier of disabled youth to Amazon. Likewise, we work with about 650 companies on this. We work with educated youth. That's a newer program to put them into jobs. And therefore, this gave us access to a completely different kind of companies in the IT and the banking sector. And what we do is we pick up a topic which impacts, which is an industry which is able to absorb youth with disabilities, large like the banking and financial or the hospitality sector. Now we're planning to do on the e-commerce. And then we do a study which basically shows best practices. It gives some data. It shows best practitioners who've been able to overcome challenges and have a career path. And the government launches these studies. They circulated to people like Niti Aayog or the policy makers. And so we are able to influence both policy and influence companies, which is very important to us. Those who are sitting on the fence and wondering whether they should become inclusive or not, they read these studies and say, hey, you know, my friend in so-and-so company is doing it, and so should I. So that begins or strengthens their path of inclusion. I think in disability, some of the voices have been heard, and the government has passed a phenomenal legislation, which is the Right to PWD Act 2016. And it is, I mean, many advanced countries don't have this legislation. So in our sensitizing to companies, we always tell companies, listen, it's a social mandate, you know, and we make them aware of it. It, for the first time, talks about the right to a person with disability to education and employment. And that really strengthens the hand of organizations like ours, because, you know, even though in India, there's a huge gulf, you know, talk of various gulfs. There's such a huge gulf between policy being made and what actually happens on the ground, because you depend on state governments to actually carry out the mandate. But it doesn't matter. I look at it as an opportunity. I look at it as an opportunity because I can tell companies that, and we know how governments work. One fine day he'll wake up and it'll become a mandate everywhere. And there are implications for the private sector in the act. So, so to me, I think policy is important, research is important. I think it's up to us to take and to cull out what is there by which you can influence the others, strengthen your own hands. And in disability, I think the time is now. Much more needs to be done.
Absolutely. Thank you, Meera, for this really insightful, taking us through your journey for youth, for jobs, but also reiterating the fact that, this is not, it's an ecosystem level change. So when you're working, it has to be at the larger conversation that you're talking about, and not just sort of just myopic skilling or looking at individual programmatic details. I think that's something that's really.
And looking at that, though it was anecdotal, the government just decided, let's set up a skilling mission. And what the mission did, because it worked in scale, you had a private sector person sitting there, you had a phenomenal, very, very supportive government, which, allowed me to do whatever I want. There were no cut and paste solutions. So you obviously had to innovate. So I did a lot of pro work, which was very market-led. They gave me a budget as the work became more and more successful. I took a budget from 1 crore to 300 crores. So after me, there was always only a government person, no longer a private sector person. But I think what was important was that we managed to put the word placement for all skilling programs of the government. And that was so phenomenal. And that shows the influence of even one word, because all the training skilling programs of the government became outcome oriented. Formerly, they were just ended with the word with trainings. There were programs like TRISM, which were training for training's sake. But I think that, is something which I find is extremely important. People, you forget who, I mean, even I forget sometimes that we did it over here, but I think that's important. But what you do outside when you're no longer embedded in the government, then what do you do? That's an example of me in the government. Okay. I think about it and I realize the model is that you should work quietly without making noise and achieve a scale which no one can afford to ignore you. And that's what happens today. If a parliamentary delegation comes and looks at our work and sees that we are doing jobs for the disabled youth, then they ask questions saying that, hey, listen, why aren't the non-disabled programs of the country actually also giving jobs? So I think it's important to work quietly. And then in the long term, Sharanya, if I can take one more minute, I think I have some suggestions. I think one is that we need to give a voice to the community, whichever community it is. And therefore, the next phase of our program is what we call the grassroots academies, where it's going to be of the disabled, by the disabled. That's one. Second is, I think we need to use technology for data. We have a very robust MIS IT architecture, which is customized to our needs. But what we're doing next is we are setting up an AI-triggered job portal. And we're working on the back end to make sure. So you sort of thinking, okay, what kind of data, what kind of analytics should I pull out, which will make me sure that I can influence policy. And to me, therefore, the most fundamental thing is that we need to have partnerships. We need to have partnerships between implementing organizations which are passionate about data, passionate about change, passionate about impact. We know knowledge is power. We know policy is power. So how do you two come together when you have complementary competencies, as I say?
Absolutely, Meera. I think the power of partnerships is where the success will lie. And I think another thing that you said really resonated to me, because this kind of resonates with our work, JPAL's work, JPAL South Asia's work in working closely with state governments in India, which is this balance of working in an embedded fashion from within the government, because to co-create solutions that are relevant and constantly work very closely with functionaries of the state, and at the same time have an objective lens, which is sort of being able to have an honest conversation of what is working and what is not working. And going back to Ashwini's point, having that space to be able to, and that trust from the government to say that yes, we are willing to go through this journey of understanding, because there may be some solutions that are actually not working, and so you may want to actually scale down those programs equally. So I think it's not only about scaling up programs, but it's equally
Absolutely.
about also stopping funding for what's not working, which is sort of a much harder conversation to have, because to kill anything in the government is all near impossible. So I think that's something where we have also, we're experimenting at least over a decade of how to really institutionalize a culture of decision making, evidence-based decision making in states, working closely with their data systems and digitization systems, co-creating solutions with them, but then also having the space to be able to evaluate that, bringing in researchers and policymakers for partnerships, for having these conversations in a very, very ongoing, constant way, and then forging partnerships at multiple levels, so that because it's not only at a department level. Some of these, when it gets to a policy level, it requires higher level approvals. So you need multiple actors, even if you talk about a particular state, to come and have trust in this evidence-based lens to looking at decisions. So I think completely concur with you on this, and I think it really resonates with your experience as well. I'm going to move to a slightly, I'm going to request Professor Deshpande, because you've done such interesting work on how socially stigmatized groups internalize stigma, and how government policies can actually be successful in targeting notions of self-worth. So can you shed some light on this? It'll be really, really insightful.
Yeah, I think yesterday my co-author Deepti presented in one of the panels, one of our papers on the role of National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. So how that can change what people consider remunerative earnings, and that can have a differential impact on castes that are lower down in the hierarchy. In other words, after NREGA was implemented, as a result of NREGA implementation, what people thought was remunerative, that expectation changed. So the sense of, whatever they were getting earlier, but, those who considered it remunerative, that perception changed, and it changed by a greater amount for the relatively disadvantaged or stigmatized caste groups. So just the presence of a program that gives a minimum wage whether it's not a condition on whether you actually access that program or not, but the fact that that program is there at minimum wage, available to everybody, regardless of their caste background, then changes people's expectations. And of course, what changes, further changes it leads to, that remain to be seen. But I think that's a very powerful result of, instituting a floor, for example, for wages, that then people think, okay, this is what I'm entitled to, and that could lead to putting pressures on other employers, or just not accepting degrading treatment, etc., etc. So it could set into motion a whole range of positive outcomes. Of course, our data, we were not able to study that, but we were able to study the change in perceptions. So I think that's the paper that you're referring to, Sharanya.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, that's really fascinating to see, within what's going on, what really is working to counter some of these, so set some of these expectations, because otherwise sort of this floor is not set, and they internalize, especially there's a caste lens to which they internalize the stigma. I think that's really, really fascinating. I think there's a question for you, Professor Deshpande. This is on what do you really think are some of the challenges facing diversity in economics in India today?
Yeah, good question. I'm getting involved in sort of gathering the data for diversity in economics, which is not easy to gather, but we are engaged in that process. So we'll see. Well, a part of it is, I guess, the patterns that get established, then they get reproduced. So if there is a particular, if there are members of particular, gender or caste or religious groups that dominate the profession, then that sort of breeds, a similar sort of profile of younger people. But I think the good news is that in the younger institutions, within, I'm now only talking about academic field, and that there's economists get employed in other fields as well. So I don't have the data for that. But within academics now in India, there are lots of opportunities for employment within institutions that are either getting created or new departments within existing institutions. So for example, IITs everywhere now have a humanities and social sciences section, which is recruiting economists. There are institutions called ICERs everywhere, in the non-metro cities particularly, which are recruiting economists. So in the younger institutes that are just from scratch recruiting people, you see, at least in certain dimensions, for example, gender, the gaps are smaller than others. But remember that, Sharanya used this terminology of pipeline. And I think that's where we need to focus on, is that if you want to see the change at the top of the pipeline, we have to go back all the way and see where the pipeline is leaking, right? I mean, so when do people get to the top? And by assistant professors, that's not even the top, because between assistant professors and, senior professors, there are still other hoops to be jumped through. But even at the assistant professor level, which is the entry level in academic jobs, if there are gaps of, gender gaps, caste gaps, religious representation, etc., then we need to think, okay, we are looking at one portion of the pipeline. Where do these gaps begin? At what stage are people dropping out? At what stage are they segregating, out of economics, for example? And I think so that's something that I'm hoping to be able to do soon or later, I don't know, depends on the data, not so easily available. And so that's really a huge challenge. And then we might have to go back all the way to primary school level as well, because, as you know, economics is a very mathematically intensive subject. And one of the major reasons that people often drop out of economics is because they don't want to do the math, right? But that's the nature of the discipline at the moment, for good or for bad. That's what it is. So is it math training that will help people retain people in economics? Where are the disadvantages? So you have to look at the whole pipeline. You can't, if you want to begin change at one level, overnight, it may not be possible until you increase the supply of people who can even reach up to that level.
Absolutely, Professor Deshpande. Actually, I'm going to now tell Noreen to add to this, because I think they are at North America doing something quite similar to, bring into the fold, look at it as from the pipeline, and really engage closely with, universities and at different levels, so that this pipeline can be strengthened. So, Noreen, can you just touch upon that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I would probably be saying a lot of the same things that have already been shared. I mean, I think, at JPAL in North America, when we were thinking, okay, wanting to diversify and think about and bring more researchers into the network from backgrounds that have been historically excluded in economics, and then realizing that at that moment, that is too late to be looking, because you have to think about sort of who sort of is able to kind of get to the point where they could be, considered for these academic positions at all different levels. And then on top of that, be invited to join different sort of organizations or other bodies of research networks and decision-making. And so really starting to look backwards in that pipeline. I definitely hear the point in terms of wanting to go, how far back do you go, and think that there's a lot that can be said in terms of really building in inclusion and focusing on different levels. I think at JPAL North America, where we have been focusing a lot of our thought and energy is around this sort of college and high school sort of pipeline and transformation, and recognizing that, even when thinking about college, like, well, it might make sense to go back even to high school, right? To make sure that students understand that economics is even a field that they can join, and what are the questions that you can answer in economics, and understanding how far reaching it really is and how connected it is to policy change. And so I think that is where we're hoping to do a lot of this work, is really sort of bring young people in, and in terms of like skill building for sure, but also just raising awareness and knowledge about what it means to participate in this space, so that hoping to increase energy and enthusiasm among young people, especially from historically excluded groups, so that when they go into college, they can go in with the mindset that this is a field that they can join, that they could be a part of, and understanding that there is sort of additional outreach that is necessary, because we're dealing with young people from groups that are not seeing themselves represented in the classes that they're going to be taking. And so then also thinking, how can we build in these other programs like mentorship pairings and other things like that, to make sure that it's not just getting students excited and prepared to go into this field, but making sure that they really have sort of the support network that they need in order to be able to stay in and to get as much out as they can, and to really excel in the field. So I think that's really where we've been doing a lot of our thinking at JPAL North America, and really excited to just learn more and see how we can continue to sort of work with other organizations and really strengthen this work. Because at the end of the day, I think we do all have the same goal of wanting to really diversify the pipeline and make sure that our research and our policies are being much more inclusive and driven by the communities that are impacted the most.
Great. Noreen, actually, there's another question for you as well. You mentioned the Black Lives Movement when you spoke, and I think what role, what link does activism have to play when you look at this research to a policy funnel, right? What are your thoughts on how activists and those working, in research and the policy space how can they work together to drive this agenda for more inclusive policy making?
Yes, happy to answer it. I apologize. There's a bit of noise outside my home right now. I hope it's not too distracting. I personally think that activism plays a really, really key role in strengthening and changing sort of the conversation and thinking about how we sort of engage with policies. I think that, I shared the example of what we see sort of at JPAL North America in terms of we're already having conversations and thinking about things, but then there are moments of real sort of change and conversation change that's happening that really helps to push us in ways and a much faster to respond. And so I think that, there is definitely a role there. And I think there's this responsibility for us at organizations and institutions to really make sure that we have systems in place to be able to respond to these conversations and to what we're hearing from the ground. And I think that that's where we do need to continue to sort of look internally to make sure that we have those systems in place so that we can be listening and responding in ways that are meaningful. So I definitely do see that. I mean, I think that we've seen this within our internal policies that are also impacting sort of how we're working externally as well. And so I think that there's a lot more for that. And I know we've been giving a lot of thought in terms of how can we really sort of adapt the way that we work as an organization so that we can be flexible and we can be responsive in order to address these moments when they come up and be prepared to make changes, whether that is, in a pandemic, creating a whole new pipeline of research and supporting projects responding to COVID, to thinking about how we can really sort of catalyze and strengthen research around race and racism, especially after what we've been seeing with the Black Lives Matter protests. So yes, I absolutely see that connection and definitely think that there's a lot more that we do need to do to make sure that we can really hear activists and respond to those conversations.
Thanks, Noreen. No, totally agree with what you just said, and I think it is really a coalition of actors that needs to come to enable this to happen. My next question is to Professor Deshpande. I think this is there in the Q&A box, which is sort of, you mentioned in your opening remarks that decision makers are often, don't necessarily acknowledge or recognize the discrimination or social identity matters. So from your experience, what do you think can be ways to change this thinking with policymakers? And I think I just wanted to add, because, often the way governments are structured in a very siloed departmental manner, right? In the way the allocation of business happens, at least within India. This intersectionality might be really, really hard to imbibe and absorb from a government lens. So how do you ensure these conversations happen? And how do you get them to recognize this?
So obviously, take whatever I say with a pinch of salt, because I haven't actively worked with government, from the inside. So maybe my remarks are completely off the, tragic, whatever is needed. But here are my thoughts. So I think that for any change to come in the way funds are allocated or programs are designed, or targets are set, etc., I think that it has to come from the top, because the penalty for making a mistake in government is huge and nobody wants to do that, right? You're much better off just following an order, even if it means being bureaucratic to the point of inaction, than to take an active step and find yourself foul of somebody or the other who will say, why did you do this? Why did you give this money here, etc., etc. So that, this is a problem that we all face with, extremely bureaucratic government officials, where it's something very obvious. It's, we can see it. They can also see it actually, but they won't sign because there's something or the other missing. So I think to expect that it will be bottoms up is not very realistic. So I think functionaries respond to the message that they're seeing from the top, and the same functionaries can function very differently depending on what the message they perceive as coming from the top. So there's a lot of self-censorship that happens. And so I think that whatever change has to happen from the top. Having said that, I did some work in Maharashtra on the Maharashtra Rural Livelihoods Mission. And we did a survey, et cetera, et cetera. So we had to deal with the MSRLM team, in Maharashtra. They were amazingly dedicated government officials who really were there because they wanted to make a change. It was humbling to see that, to see their work and to see their drive and to see their initiative. And so all the stereotypes that one hears about bureaucracy and government and, inaction and lethargy, they were completely shattered as far as I was concerned. And it was, even now when I think about all those trips that I did for field work, it sends, I get goosebumps just thinking of how difficult conditions of work are for many of them, but they want to make a difference. So I think that there is enough, maybe I'm over-generalizing from my experience in Maharashtra, but I do feel that I think there's enough of a critical mass of government officials who genuinely want government to make a difference to people's lives, right? And so I think of that critical mass and think of a messaging from the top. If the two align in just the right combination, I think that will make a big difference. But to expect that an individual government official sitting in some office in some state should have a change of heart and start doing things differently, I think that's unrealistic. I think people respond very much to the messaging they see around themselves. And sometimes the messaging is direct, sometimes it's indirect. You think that somebody will disapprove. That may never happen, but a lot of people's actions are public universities are a very good example of seeing that. So I was in Delhi University for close to 30 years. And oftentimes, you think of academia as a relatively free place, which it is in many ways. But oftentimes one would find one's colleagues who are in, decision-making spaces in the university bureaucracy, taking some decision, and you say, why are you doing this? Nobody has asked you to do it, but people act in anticipating what is expected of them, which may be wrong, which may be incorrect, but they do that, So I think a lot of the signaling has to come from the top. How to get that signaling to come on the top, I think that's where the electoral process matters a great deal. I think we as citizens do play a role in what kinds of governments we elect. And, I think so, I'm not saying that it's easy or it's just an overnight thing. But it can happen. Even in the United States, you saw big change in the recent elections at the presidential level. And so that change at the top does make a difference to how decisions get taken.
Absolutely. And I think working across, right from the start to those who will make it to the top has been one of our experiences. So for instance, we work closely with the IAS Training Academy to actually, because this will form the pipeline of future chief secretaries and principal secretaries and additional chief secretaries. So really ensuring that, their thinking is more data and evidence based. And I'm sure you do the same, through Ashoka University. And I think one thing I'd really be interested in knowing is that how do you really think inclusivity can be taught within, economic and public policy curricula? because you're working in this space. So how this is something that is quite hard to communicate, I'm sure. So how do you do this successfully?
So when I was at the Delhi school, I designed a course for master students called Economics of Discrimination. And that was the first course of that kind that ever got designed in any Indian university. And I taught it there for 20 years before I moved to Ashoka. And I teach the same course, not the same course, but I teach Economics of Discrimination at Ashoka as well. And it's interesting that certainly at the Delhi school, in my first lecture, typically when I used to talk about the scope of the course, there was a huge pushback from the students. Come on, I mean, India is very meritocratic, and I don't think in terms of caste, I don't think in terms of this, and I don't think in terms of that. And so it was almost an accusation that I'm exaggerating a problem that doesn't actually exist, And then, so in the first lecture itself, I had to give some examples and ask them, okay, so in this situation, what do you do? A very common example that I would take is, when the person who comes to collect garbage, and I wish Biswada had been here because he would have given many more eloquent examples. And so one of the questions I would ask is, the person who comes to collect the garbage, would you let, or not you, but would your family let that person come into the kitchen? So most people said, no, they don't, he doesn't come into the kitchen. So I said, okay, then they ask for a glass of water. What do? Do you give a glass that you would normally use for family members, or do you have a separate glass? So everybody said separate glass. So they were even surprised that that was even a question that anybody could be asking. So I said, well, if your friend visits, do you give a separate glass, or do you give one of the glasses that you use for the family? So they said same glass, because it gets washed. And everybody said it very genuinely with a straight face, without realizing that there was a huge contradiction here. I said, why? Etc. etc. And so then they said, well, those people they live in a dirty environment, etc. etc. I said, have you heard of soap? Can you not wash, the glass and make it clean, etc. etc. So that's how the conversation started. And I said, well, you said caste doesn't matter. I said, here is an example of caste, which we are so unconscious about, and that we don't even see that as any form of, and sort of practicing untouchability. We didn't even think about it. And I said, did you know that untouchability is punishable by law? And they hadn't even thought about it, etc. etc. So you go on, and then you say, when you get married, if you have an arranged match, would you be looking within your caste? They said, of course. I said, why? They said, because it's customary, it's cultural, etc. So, so things like that. So when you start having these conversations, initially there's a lot of pushback. But when we present them with data and with evidence, as I've been doing over many, many years now, I find that obviously one can't convince everybody, but by the time the course finishes, the number of students who write every year, and that's really makes it all worthwhile, which is the number of students who write every year to say that I'd never, ever even thought about these issues, because they didn't matter to me, right? Because, it's like men saying this patriarchy, I hadn't noticed, obviously you hadn't, because you are not at the receiving end of patriarchal pressures and so on, right? Or white privilege. So there's racism, I hadn't noticed. Obviously you wouldn't if you were white, and so on. So whenever you belong to the privileged group in any one dimension, you don't see the negative consequences of that, etc. And so on. So I think these are the conversations. It's a process. It is not a 0-1 that you inject an injection and tomorrow racism will disappear, or any casteism or any other ism is going to disappear. So it's a process, and it's a continuous process.
Absolutely. I think what you've just said resonates so much even with our research on this gender sensitization curriculum that I was talking to you about, which NGO Breakthrough experimented with and we tested, which was 2.5 years of, this for both boys and girls. So that's the one other thing, right? Like, it's not about, when you talk about, what is the end and what's the means to the end, right? So they are two different things. So actually, to counter these stereotypes, they were actually having conversations as part of this curriculum where the children themselves made inferences. And this was a conversation starter where they were asked things like, who cooks at home? Who cooks in a restaurant? And they said, okay, a female cooks at home and who cooks in a restaurant, a male, and how does society view these two types of activities, right? So, and then they came to their own conclusions, and this kind of like over time, as you said, it's not a quick fix sort of a process. Over time, this actually helped change the attitudes of students, and having these conversations early, right, at the secondary stage itself, and at a student level at different phases is really very important. And this goes to even change social norms, which are usually so difficult to even change, because these perceptions form really early in life, and having that for both boys and girls is also so important. There's a question for you, Meera. I think, what concerns have companies expressed when hiring people with special needs? And sort of how many of those concerns actually hold true?
I think generally the questions are, people don't understand which job roles to put them in if they hire. So second is, they don't know the do's and don'ts, right from how to communicate with them. How do you make sure that the non-disabled and the disabled work together? They want to know, is it expensive to hire? You have to make the infrastructure accessible. The technology has to sync with the existing technology. And if it's a manufacturing sector, they're always worried about safety. So by and large, these are the concerns. So the way we address it, Sharanya, is through a series of services which we give them. I have a corporate team which is everywhere. And so we do sensitization workshops actually for different levels, right from the board to the manager and to the supervisor level also. We do something called a job role matrix, which is a map which we give them to tell them which disability can fit where and what are the simple workplace adaptations you need to do. Accessibility audit, technology, what are the technologies which support? For example, if you're a visually impaired, you have this JAWS, which is the talking software. Yes, it can be done. It's not complex. Part of the game is also measurement. So we encourage companies to measure the impact of the change, because finally, I think it's the bottom line that matters for companies. So you have to make sure that when you give this alternative labor pool, it helps business.
Absolutely. There's one more question that I'd like to pose to you. It's in the Q&A box, Meera, which is, what is the role of data versus stories in changing policymakers' minds around inclusion? Because they're both obviously useful, but the question is, when is what more useful and what is complementary?
I think it's a bit of a tough one, because I think stories also, if told well, they do marshal change. I really believe that. But I think it has to be a combination of both. As I keep saying, for example, if you look at the disability space or even our own work, there's enough qualitative data or qualitative anecdotes to show that there's change, because the youth goes back, he saves, he's paying back the high cost debt of his parents, he's the role model, he's educating his siblings with the savings. All that we can measure. So we can measure the economic impact, but how do you measure the behavioral change which we'd like to? Okay. So I think those are some of the issues which a field practitioner grapples with, which there are no easy answers. So I do think that it should be a combination, of both. You need to tell a good story to attract economists and those who have competencies which are different from y'all, so that together you can move the field a step forward. And that's finally, I think, what we all want to do.
Absolutely, and I just wanted to add a little bit from the JPAL's, JPAL South Asia's experience to this. That of course, so one thing we've realized is before jumping into evaluation, ensure that we are asking the right questions. And for this, the initiative, the initial formative stage of research is super important, especially when we work with governments, which is bulk of our portfolio now in South Asia. To really unbundle the issue itself, the diagnostics of the issue, which is a combination of administrative data as well as field-based insights, to make sure that you're spending money on asking the right questions. And then, which informs the research question, I think then is when the solutioning stage comes, when our researchers have conversations with practitioners, with governments and NGOs alike, to really co-create solutions that are relevant. So I think a lot of the stories from the field are super important to develop the right research questions. And then I think the stories come at the end of the research to policy funnel, where it is an evidence to policy story, often because that is the language that policymakers understand. But once it is backed by rigorous evidence of what works, what doesn't work, you tell a story which is easier, for whether it's a policy insight or other kinds of sort of shapes and forms that it takes to make that evidence more consumable for policymakers, because their language is very different from the 60, 70 page papers that get published in econ journals. And sort of that story is quite different from the story that goes into the research and sort of the insights that emerge from the research. So I think I just thought I'd add that perspective from our work and experience in working with governments in India. Okay, I think there's one more question, and I'd like to pose this to Professor Deshpande. So behavioral research posits that people sometimes tend to get more entrenched in their beliefs when presented with contrarian evidence. So how should one think about broaching these topics, with those who believe that these problems don't exist?
Yeah, I wish I knew the answer to this question. Well, I mean, just keep at it. There'll always be some people at the fringes, spectrum of opinions are always, hardliners. And maybe no fact can make them change their mind. But there is a very large number of people who are not hardliners. I think that's the community we need to be talking to. So instead of focusing on the most difficult person and say, oh, that person is never going to change their mind, fine, that's okay. But there are many other not so difficult people, who are willing to listen, who are willing to engage. So I think the strengthening the debate and discussion element in public policy, and I mean public policy in a wider sense, not just government person speaking, not that way, but I think a climate and a culture of discussion and engagement, and a tolerance for a different view, So these are critical mass kind of issues, which is if there's enough number of people who inculcate this culture, then it spreads. No one person can change anything. So I think here, the collective mass is important, and I wouldn't focus so much on the hardliners whose views will never probably change. But we need to come to a point where the hardliners become the exception of the rule. There'll always be hardliners in every society along every dimension, but they should stand out for being exceptionally bizarre. And people will say, oh, what? People actually believe that, rather than saying, oh yeah, that seems to make sense. When the hardline views start to become mainstream, I think that's the time to worry.
Oh, that's a great point, Professor Deshpande. I think with that, just quick check-in with the panelists. Would you like to have some concluding remarks in the next, maybe 1 minute each? So starting with Professor Deshpande, since.
Yeah, I've been speaking so much, I don't know what else I can say, but I think that all these strands that came up in the discussion are all important, which is within academics, the composition of the academic community, is important. So we need diversity there. I think one very important area in terms of scientific evidence, academic community, is a geographical disparity. When you look at the top journals, you look at the top publications, the top conferences, it's a very small set of primarily US universities and academics based there that are in this hallowed circle, and most of us are out of it completely, right? But there's good research going on outside as well. So I think there's also a geographic element to what is considered good research, so I think sort of the clubby nature of the profession needs to be broken down a little bit, and so people who are outside the clubs, need to be. So I think the gatekeepers need to sort of move away and make it door open. That's the professional side. The other side is the conversation between the academics and the policymakers. We talked a lot about that. And then, Meera's experience, the bringing in the practitioners, they're very valuable insights, which probably research is not even able to cover, so get those insights as well, and listen to people on the field who are doing works, and just be open and be willing to engage.
Thank you. Thank you so much for so beautifully summing that up, Professor Deshpande. Noreen, any concluding thoughts?
Yes, thank you. I think some things that come to mind for me, and just in thinking about sort of where we're going and where we're going as an organization, but also where sort of I hope sort of the field is going as well, as how we think about and going back to sort of the point that you raised in terms of asking the right questions, asking the right research questions, is really thinking very critically about how we build inclusion into every stage of the research process, from the very beginning in terms of who are the researchers and who are the communities and who are the organizations that are being included in this, and to also thinking about sort of what are the methodologies that are being used, and what are the questions that are being really have information to be able to share and communicate what these findings really mean for those who are most impacted by the research. And so I think, something that I'm really interested in, and I know that we're thinking about a lot at JPAL, is really how do we build this piece in throughout the research process, and then what can we learn from that, and how can we see some positive change?
Thank you, Noreen. Meera, any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's, to me, it's quite simple. It's listen, what I would say, and listen to voices in a field completely different from yours. So, for example, nowadays, a lot of academicians send me their papers if they've written on disability. And I groan when I have to comment and give expert comments on it. And I say, oh God, can't you write it simpler? Isn't there an easier way to communicate your message? So to me, forums like this, listening to Professor Deshpande, Sharanya, Noreen, it really stimulates my mind. And I think today I've got at least 2 good ideas to go and test out on the field. So listen. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Meera, for that. I just wanted to make a quick announcement here. We missed Mr. Wilson. He was not able to join because, again, he was working on the research to action funnel. He was with the Secretary of Social Justice and Empowerment, last minute calling. So again, these are the realities when one is working with policymakers. So he sent his regrets. So I just wanted to make that announcement. He had said that he'll be able to join for a few minutes in the end, but the time did not permit. I think thank you so much to all the panelists, for such insightful thoughts, and for deeply engaging in conversations, and for so patiently answering all the questions and giving your insights. And as we discussed, I think this is the power of conversations, coalitions, partnerships of researchers, policymakers, advocacy organizations, NGOs, donors, everybody to come together to understand and appreciate this mandate of how do we look at these intersectionalities of development programming, and right from the research to action funnel, if I talk about how are the RFPs getting shaped, so many new ideas we got in terms of how that how you're attracting a more diverse group, both in terms of who gets to do that research, but also what gets researched, and then of course including that, broadening that base of research to first tackle what are the biases, what is the root of the problem, unbundling that, and then for that to feed into the solution, and for this pipeline to be strengthened, to have more diverse voices, to be able to shape both the research, but also inform what policies get enacted, I think. And that is where the advocacy organizations come in. And it would have been really nice to hear the work of the Safai Karamchari Andolan, but maybe for another time in that sense. And I think finally on partnerships with policymakers and practitioners, the pains of actually having the data-based and research-based decisions feed into high-level policies, both at the state level as well as the center level, is something that it's not such a straightforward process. But I think that is the power of partnerships. And I think we got lots of ideas on small successes and big wins as well. Through knowing each of your individual journeys, whether it is what Meera said about, sometimes economic solutions help to counter or at least reduce social biases, and how that interaction shapes up is important to figure out, or the fact that, looking at just first collecting the right data to even be able to make decisions, whether it is on placement of skilling programs, or because how do you even develop some of those priors and understanding unless you have these parameters in place. Noreen spoke about labor market discrimination and how, examples from the US of how this was, countered through the work of JPAL and some of the powerful experiments on gender sensitization and all of these diverse areas. Professor Deshpande had so many insights on how, research can inform decision making, how to go beyond, have diverse types of research that is conducted, not just, impact evaluations, but even really unbundling and to go to the root of the problem and identifying the biases and to even figure out who is excluded. I think those were really, really powerful examples of some of these conversations which can inform how to strengthen this research to action funnel. So thank you so much. Back to the Belong team.
Thank you, Sharanya, and a huge thank you to all our panelists as well. It was a very enriching discussion, and there's a lot of food for thought for us to chew over as we think about the points that were made today. I'm really excited to also be announcing our sessions for the upcoming days. We have one session which is being co-hosted with JPAL South Asia once again tomorrow, which is titled Designing Inclusive MEL Systems for SDGs, Measurement, Innovations and Challenges. This panel discussion will be taking place from 5 to 7 p.m. tomorrow and will be moderated by Tithi Mukhopadhyay, who is the Director for Research at JPAL South Asia. And we'll be joined as our panel in the form of our panelists, people from Oxford Policy Management. We have an independent consultant with us called Naomi Falkenberg, and we also have Sarah Bal from the STAR Network joining us. So we're super thrilled for that session as well, and we look forward to seeing you all there. We'll also have a session tomorrow at 7:30 p.m. titled When Inclusive Processes Fail, Lessons Learned and Limitations of Structural Measures in Inclusion, which is being co-hosted by Dalberg Design. And here we'll be talking a lot about how we can learn from failures that might occur in the designing of inclusion-based programs. So we look forward to seeing you all engaged in these discussions as well. A big thank you once again for joining in today. We look forward to seeing you in the future and have a great evening ahead. I'll be putting the link for the schedule as well as the registration link in the chat below for all those who might want to see it. Thank you. Have a great night ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharanya. Bye. Bye.